Welcome to the Global Risk Podcast from Solace Global. This is your weekly global intelligence briefing, covering the key geopolitical and security developments shaping the world. In the Americas, we examine President Daniel Ortega's announcement that Nicaragua will no longer hold elections, and the growing risk of unrest despite an expected government crackdown. We also assess the severe flooding across northern and central Chile, where the rapidly developing El Niño weather system is likely worsening conditions and extending the recovery effort. Across Europe, the Middle East and Africa, we look at protests in Italy following a death during a police arrest, one of Russia's largest ballistic missile attacks on Kyiv, and Hamas's appointment of a new political leader. We also assess the expanding conflict between the United States and Iran, Yemen's Houthi movement announcing a maritime embargo against Saudi Arabia, and a major joint offensive by Islamist and separatist groups in northern Mali. And in Asia-Pacific, we cover deadly flash flooding in Afghanistan and the growing influence of India's student-led cockroach protest movement following violent demonstrations in Delhi. Expert insight, clear analysis, and the context you need, all in one concise briefing. We begin in the Americas, where President Daniel Ortega has declared that Nicaragua will hold no further elections, a move that is likely to increase political tensions despite the country's extensive crackdown on dissent. On July 19th, Nicaraguan President Daniel Ortega declared that there will never be elections here again in order to prevent the opposition from attaining power. He added that he would work with Congress to pass new laws to build a wall against the opposition, saying that the days when parties backed by the Yankees and the Somochistas would return to power are over, never again. The announcement was made during the official ceremony marking the 47th anniversary of the 1979 Sandinista Revolution, in which Ortega helped to overthrow Anastasio Somoza's dictatorship. The speech was his first public appearance in 2 months. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. General elections had been due to take place in Nicaragua by November 2026 to elect the co-presidents and members of the National Assembly. Co-presidents Daniel Ortega and his wife, Rosario Murillo, have consolidated near-total control over Nicaragua's political system. A former guerrilla leader, Ortega rose to prominence after the left-wing Sandinista National Liberation Front led the 1979 revolution that overthrew the Somoza dictatorship. He lost the 1990 presidential election, but returned to power in 2007 and has remained in office ever since. Constitutional reforms approved in 2025 elevated Murillo from vice president to co-president, and further concentrated control over the legislative, judicial, and electoral institutions within the executive. The Ortega-Murillo government has become increasingly authoritarian, particularly since nationwide anti-government protests challenged its authority in 2018. The administration has dismantled institutional checks, restricted civil society, effectively eliminated credible political opposition, and used the security forces and the judiciary to suppress dissent. Human rights organizations and UN investigators have accused the authorities of killing protesters, arbitrarily detaining and mistreating government critics, closing independent media outlets and non-governmental organizations, and targeting journalists, religious figures, opposition politicians, former Sandinista allies, and other perceived dissidents. The January 2026 capture of Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro by United States forces, alongside increased U.S. pressure on Cuba, has highly likely intensified Ortega's sense of vulnerability, as both countries were important regional allies of Nicaragua. Former U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton referred to the three nations as the Troika of Tyranny and the genesis of a sordid cradle of communism in the Western Hemisphere. Ortega's move to solidify his leadership has highly likely been driven by the perceived threat from the United States. Despite the government's de facto ban on protests since September 2018, there is a realistic possibility that Ortega's announcement will trigger unrest. However, the government's extensive repression apparatus may dissuade many people from taking part and may limit any unrest to small-scale clashes. The Ortega Murillo administration is likely to interpret even limited opposition activity as a potential threat to regime survival, and will highly likely respond to major civil unrest with severe crackdowns, including mass arrests and potentially even the use of live ammunition. Elsewhere in the region, severe flooding has displaced thousands across northern and central Chile, with El Niño likely contributing to one of the country's most significant winter storms in recent years. On July 16th, a frontal system, the boundary between two air masses with different properties, such as temperature or density, brought heavy rain across northern and central Chile, including Santiago. This caused infrastructure damage, flooding, and widespread disruption to basic services. The Valparaiso and Coquimbo regions were the most severely affected. However, disruptions were also recorded in 10 of Chile's 16 regions. The Chilean Meteorological Directorate stated that the system represents one of the most significant storms recorded in recent years. At least 13 people have been killed by the floods, with a further 100,000 displaced or stranded in rural settlements. Approximately 400,000 homes lost power as a result of the system, most of them in the Valparaiso region. President José Antonio Cast's government initially declared a preventive emergency across 10 regions, enabling the pre-positioning of rescue personnel, equipment, and other resources. Military units, police, firefighters, municipal teams, and the National Service for Disaster Prevention and Response were subsequently deployed to assist evacuations, conduct search operations, and restore access to isolated communities. On July 20th, the government declared a constitutional state of catastrophe covering the Coquimbo region and Huasco province in the Atacama region. The measure allows the authorities to mobilize additional resources, accelerate emergency procurement, and place military officers in charge of coordinating security and disaster response operations in designated areas. Recovery operations are likely to be prolonged in remote valleys and mountain communities, where road reconstruction may be required before heavy machinery and humanitarian supplies can be delivered. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. Winter is the main rainy season in central Chile, although precipitation patterns vary considerably across the country. July marks the peak of the rainy season in central and northern Chile, while Patagonia experiences more unpredictable year-round precipitation. The ongoing weather event, however, is unusually strong and has led to increased rainfall even in Atacama and Coquimbo. These regions are significantly more arid than those further south and can go long periods with little meaningful rainfall. As a result, unusually intense winter storms can cause severe and disproportionate damage. The rapidly developing El Niño cycle has likely influenced the severity of the weather event. While it typically causes drought conditions in northern South America, Central America, and the Caribbean, El Niño increases precipitation in more southern latitudes. In Chile, increased precipitation at high altitudes can lead to rapid glacial melting and flash runoff. This significantly raises the risk of mudslides, landslides, and glacial lake outburst floods, particularly in valley communities. The environmental risk in Chile is likely to remain elevated even after the rain subsides. Runoff from mountain catchments can continue to raise river levels for several hours or even days. Waterlogged ground also increases the risk of delayed landslides, rockfall, and road collapses. Additional rainfall, even at moderate levels, could trigger renewed flooding, as soils and drainage systems are already saturated. Turning to Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, protests have erupted across Bologna, following the death of a man during a police arrest, with further demonstrations likely in the coming days. Violence broke out overnight between July 20th and 21st in the northern Italian city. The unrest followed reports that a 42-year-old Moroccan citizen had died during an arrest. A video shared online shows police officers pinning the man to the ground. He reportedly had heart issues and asthma, and can be heard repeatedly shouting, "Help, help, that's enough." The unrest began that afternoon in the Palastro area, where the incident took place, before intensifying and spreading to the city centre. An estimated 5,000 people took part. Later, smaller groups of protesters clashed with police. At least 50 officers were injured, and multiple arrests were made. Local media also reported several incidents of vandalism and looting in the city centre during the protests. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. The rapid escalation of unrest following the first reports of the incident almost certainly complicated police response strategies. It also resulted in a failure to contain the situation in Bologna's city centre overnight. As seen in other cases, most notably the deadly shooting of a teenager in France in 2023, incidents of reported police brutality can rapidly trigger large-scale protests within hours of being shared online. Bologna has a higher civil unrest risk level than most Italian cities of a similar size. The city has a large student population, as it hosts the world's oldest university, and several left-wing activist groups operate there. In recent years, Bologna has been an epicenter for multiple large-scale demonstrations, typically triggered by foreign policy developments or security-related measures adopted by Italy's right-wing government. Most recently, around 20,000 people attended the Rivolta Pride March on June 13th. The demonstration had a strong pro-Palestinian and anti-government focus. Isolated confrontations occurred when participants carrying Israeli and pre-revolutionary Iranian symbols were forced out of the procession. There is a realistic possibility that further unrest will take place in Italy between July 24th and 26th. The incident's high visibility is likely to be compounded by the fact that it occurred on the 25th anniversary of the killing of an anti-G8 protester in Genoa during the 2001 summit, almost certainly the most notable case of police brutality in Italy in recent decades. Protests are likely to expand beyond Bologna to cities including Rome and Milan, with further clashes between protesters and police likely. Staying in Europe, Russia has launched one of the war's largest ballistic missile attacks on Kyiv, as Moscow continues efforts to exploit Ukraine's limited air defense capacity. Overnight, between July 18th and 19th, Russian forces carried out one of the largest ballistic missile strikes of the war, primarily targeting Kyiv and the surrounding oblast. According to the Ukrainian Air Force, around 40 missiles were launched, including 25 Iskander-M and S-400 ballistic missiles, as well as 10 Zircon anti-ship missiles, which follow a quasi-ballistic trajectory. President Volodymyr Zelensky said that Russia had been stockpiling missiles in the preceding days in preparation for the attack. Missile impacts and fires were reported across multiple districts of Kyiv, including Dniprovsky, Desnyansky, Solomiansky, Shevchenkivsky, and Sviatoshinsky. Residential buildings, warehouses, a supermarket, a dormitory, and other civilian infrastructure were hit. Ukrainian officials also reported strikes on civilian and energy infrastructure in Kharkiv, Mykolaiv, and Odessa oblasts. In Kharkiv, 3 civilians were killed in a strike on a Nova Poshta postal sorting terminal. In Kyiv, at least 1 person was killed, and 16 were wounded. Across Ukraine, local authorities reported at least 16 civilians killed and 77 injured in the preceding 24 hours, most of them in Kharkiv and Donetsk oblasts. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. Russian long-range strikes against Ukrainian cities, particularly Kyiv, have intensified significantly since Moscow's May 25th announcement of a systematic strikes campaign against the capital. This campaign has been characterized by an expanded focus on central Kyiv. Even prior to the May 24 announcement, Russian attacks were increasingly targeting areas in and around the city center, known to host foreign diplomatic missions, international organizations, and hotels used by the international community. Escalated Russian long-range strikes in June were almost certainly a key factor behind findings from the United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, released on July 14. The report stated that at least 293 Ukrainian civilians were killed and 1,990 injured in June 2026, the highest monthly total recorded since April 2022. The systematic strikes campaign has coincided with, and almost certainly contributed to, a critical Ukrainian shortage of advanced interceptors used in the Patriot air defense system. This remains Ukraine's only reliable means of intercepting ballistic missiles. The shortage almost certainly reached near exhaustion in early July. An overnight attack between July 5th and 6th was notably characterized by 0 interceptions of ballistic missiles. Russian forces have almost certainly been incentivized to exploit this shortage by launching larger-scale salvos, specifically of ballistic missiles, as reflected in the July 18th to 19th attack. This is supported by reports from Ukrainian defense sources on July 19th, indicating that Russia has already launched more ballistic missiles in July than its estimated monthly production. This includes up to 2/3 of its estimated annual quasi-ballistic Zircon missile production. Recent major Russian strike packages against Ukrainian cities suggest that the acute interceptor crisis seen in early July has likely eased, at least temporarily. However, interception rates remain low enough for Russian attacks to have a significant impact. Between July 1st and 12th, interception rates were recorded at 0 or close to 0. By comparison, the Ukrainian Air Force reported that 17 of 35 Iskander-M, Zircon, and S-400 missiles were intercepted during the attack between July 18th and 19th. This observable improvement is highly likely attributable to a delivery of U.S. interceptors, which President Zelensky said on July 9th would arrive soon. However, the interceptor shortage is highly likely to re-emerge. Lockheed Martin produces roughly 600 PAC-3 interceptors for the Patriot system each year, while Ukrainian officials assess that Russia is producing around 120 ballistic missiles per month. At the same time, the ongoing conflict in the Middle East has driven significant demand. Around 1,500 Patriot interceptors were expended in just 39 days, contributing to a global shortage. That conflict has also recently returned to a pattern of daily Iranian ballistic missile attacks. Given these pressures, it is unlikely that the United States will be willing to significantly draw down its own inventories to meet Ukraine's requirements, despite recent deliveries having likely provided a temporary easing of the acute shortage. Other proposed means of intercepting ballistic missiles in Ukraine are unlikely to meaningfully improve interception rates before at least the end of 2026. The Anti-Ballistic Missile Coalition launched with Ukraine's allies on July 13th. Ukraine's domestically produced Freyja interceptor project, the next-generation Franco-Italian SAMP/T system, and the US-Ukraine license agreement for Patriot interceptor production all remain several months to years away from being fielded at scale. While Lockheed Martin has recently unveiled a cheaper Patriot interceptor, known as the PAC-3 Adapted Capability Effector, its first test is not expected until 2028. It is therefore likely that Ukraine's elevated exposure to Russian ballistic missiles and the corresponding increase in risk associated with travel to Ukrainian cities, including central Kyiv, will remain notably high until at least the start of 2027. In the Middle East, Hamas has appointed Khalil al-Hayya as its new political leader, a decision that is likely to reinforce the group's ties with Iran. On July 20th, the Palestinian militant group announced Hayya as its political bureau chief. He is the first to hold the position since Yahya Sinwar was killed in combat with Israeli forces in the Gaza Strip in October 2024. Based in Qatar, Haya is a leading figure in Hamas's external leadership and played a central role in negotiations during the conflict that followed the October 7, 2023 attacks. In September 2025, he was targeted in an Israeli airstrike in Doha, alongside other key Palestinian negotiators. The announcement comes weeks after Hamas declared the resignation of its civil administration, the Gaza Emergency Committee, as part of the framework of the Gaza Peace Plan. Under this plan, a technocratic body, the National Committee for the Administration of Gaza, would assume administrative responsibilities in the Gaza Strip. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. The announcement is highly likely indicative of the current political balance of power within Hamas. Al-Haya reportedly narrowly defeated Khalid Mashal in the leadership contest administered by Hamas's Shura Council. Unlike Mashal, who is widely seen as close to Sunni-led Gulf states and Turkey, Al-Haya is viewed as prioritizing Hamas's partnership with Iran. The vote marks the culmination of an internal political struggle that has been ongoing for months. The February 2026 internal elections crystallized a divide between pro-Iran and pro-Turkish and Gulf-aligned factions. The appointment highly likely represents a follow-up to Hamas's decision to dismantle its administration earlier in July. Hamas representatives have reiterated their intention to be included in the NCAG and to play a direct role in governing the Gaza Strip over the long term. However, several obstacles to implementing the peace plan remain. Most notably, Hamas has indicated it is unwilling to disarm unless Israeli forces withdraw from the approximately 60 to 70% of the Gaza Strip they currently control, a condition that Israeli officials have rejected. Hamas almost certainly remains significantly weakened and constrained by supply shortages. This follows the destruction of much of its pre-war infrastructure, as well as the loss of a substantial proportion of its leadership during the protracted conflict in Gaza. Since June 2025, Israeli forces have classified Gaza as a secondary arena, assigning it lower importance than other fronts, such as Lebanon. This almost certainly reflects an assessment of Hamas's degraded capabilities. Hamas has maintained a relatively low profile during both periods of direct US-Israeli conflict with Iran, the 12-day war in 2025 and the current conflict. This likely reflects a prioritization of maintaining control over the areas of Gaza not under Israeli occupation, with occasional anti-Hamas protests presenting a notable political challenge. For Hamas, the decision to appoint the pro-Iran Al-Haya over Mashal likely reflects a commitment to remain within the Iran-led axis of resistance, as well as a desire to secure continued Iranian financial support. Prior to the outbreak of the 2023 conflict, Iran provided Hamas with approximately $100 million per year. This support will likely be seen as particularly important ahead of any future cessation of regional hostilities. However, the move could prompt opposition from Gulf states and Turkey, particularly if an Iran-aligned Hamas interferes with the Gaza peace plan's proposed political transition framework. Elsewhere in the region, the conflict between the United States and Iran continues to escalate, with both sides increasingly targeting critical infrastructure. Overnight between July 17th and 18th, U.S. Central Command carried out its 7th consecutive night of strikes against Iran. In retaliation, Iran launched attacks on targets in Jordan, Kuwait, Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia, the first such strike against Saudi Arabia in more than 3 months. Strikes by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps on Muwafaq Salti Air Base in Azraq, Jordan, killed 3 U.S. service members. A further U.S. service member was reported on July 18th to have been killed in northern Iraq during the controlled detonation of unexploded ordnance from a downed Iranian attack drone. On July 18th, the social media account of Iran's supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, issued a statement accusing the United States of repeatedly violating the Memorandum of Understanding. It described US President Donald Trump's signature as worthless and warned of further escalation from both Iran and its proxies. Iran's Deputy Foreign Minister, Kazem Garibabadi, also stated that Iran has suspended the implementation of its commitments under the Memorandum of Understanding. Overnight, between July 18th and 19th, CENTCOM carried out an 8th consecutive night of strikes against Iran. The command stated that, alongside other military targets, the strikes specifically targeted IRGC forces responsible for the attack on Jordan. The Atomic Energy Organization of Iran reported that the United States struck the Houthi nuclear power plant, which is currently under construction. The International Atomic Energy Agency said it was investigating the incident, adding that the facility is still in the very early stages of construction and contains no nuclear material. As a result, any strike would be unlikely to pose a radiological risk. On July 20th, President Trump stated that he had ordered the Pentagon to make Iran pay many times over for each death of an American service member. A day earlier, on July 19th, U.S. officials said that additional F-16 and F-35 fighter jets had begun deploying from European bases to the Middle East. Between July 20th and 23rd, CENTCOM carried out several further rounds of strikes against Iran, reaching a 12th consecutive night of operations overnight between July 22nd and 23rd. On each occasion, the IRGC launched retaliatory strikes against targets in Jordan, Kuwait, and Bahrain. Notably, Iran has repeatedly targeted a power and desalination plant in Kuwait and has launched several attacks on Jordan's southern port city of Aqaba, which borders the Israeli city of Eilat. The IRGC also claimed to have targeted an Amazon data center in Bahrain in retaliation for the reported U.S. strikes on the Houthi nuclear power plant. U.S. and Israeli officials have indicated that President Trump faces two potential courses of action: pursuing a new 10-day ceasefire aimed at reopening the Strait of Hormuz, or launching a major joint military campaign with Israel against Iran. Regional mediators, including Qatar, Egypt, and Pakistan, have reportedly presented both Washington and Tehran with the ceasefire proposal. However, on July 22nd, President Trump warned that each time Iran attacks a vessel in the Strait of Hormuz, the United States will destroy an Iranian bridge or power plant. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. The killing of U.S. service members, the first such death since March, almost certainly marks a significant escalation. It has likely increased pressure on the Trump administration to continue escalating, despite ongoing efforts by regional mediators to secure a ceasefire. The reported deployment of additional U.S. military aircraft to the region highly likely indicates that CENTCOM is shaping conditions for a potential further escalation in military operations against Iran. A U.S. intelligence assessment seen by officials reportedly indicates that the current intensity of strikes against Iran is unlikely to soften Tehran's negotiating position. IRGC hardliners have almost certainly consolidated significant power within the regime since the conflict began in late February, while some key political figures in Tehran highly likely continue to advocate for a negotiated solution with the United States. Many IRGC hardliners appear to maintain total opposition to any potential concessions. Unless the Trump administration concludes that the costs of the conflict are becoming too great to sustain, and therefore concedes to increased Iranian control of the Strait of Hormuz, almost certainly a key objective for the IRGC, which has shaped the current escalation. The conflict is likely to remain in a higher intensity phase in the short term. Characterized by regular U.S. strike packages, followed by Iranian retaliatory strikes against targets in the Gulf states and Jordan, this phase was initially less intense than the period before the April 8th ceasefire took effect. However, U.S. strikes on Iranian infrastructure and subsequent Iranian strikes on Kuwaiti electricity generation and desalination plants almost certainly mark an escalation approaching levels seen in earlier phases of the conflict. During these earlier phases, Iran conducted regular strikes against energy infrastructure, airports, and other civilian targets across the region in response to U.S. attacks on analogous sites inside Iran. This pattern of calibrated reciprocal targeting is likely continuing, as reflected in the IRGC's announcement that it had targeted an Amazon data center in Bahrain in retaliation for alleged strikes against an Iranian nuclear power plant. The continued U.S. targeting of bridges, railway and airport infrastructure, and, if confirmed, power infrastructure, has expanded its focus from military and maritime capabilities to civilian and dual-use assets. In response to President Trump's threats to conduct attacks against Iranian bridges and power plants, IRGC-affiliated media have specifically warned that the Al Tawila power plant in Abu Dhabi and the Jebel Ali power plant in Dubai in the UAE, as well as the Ras Laffan power plant in Qatar and the Riyadh power plant in Saudi Arabia, could be targeted. The attempted strikes against southern Jordan in Aqaba are likely calibrated to mark a further escalation in Iranian retaliation. However, Aqaba lies close to the Israeli city of Eilat, and Israeli air defenses were activated in response to the attacks. If sustained, such strikes risk debris falling on Israeli territory, which would highly likely increase the risk of renewed Israeli involvement in the conflict. Israeli leaders have warned of a full-force response to any direct Iranian attack, and almost certainly retain a desire to pursue several objectives militarily against Iran that were left unfulfilled in the Memorandum of Understanding. Also in the Middle East, Yemen's Houthi movement has announced a maritime embargo against Saudi Arabia, raising concerns over shipping security in the Red Sea. On July 20th, the Houthis released a statement announcing the commencement of a maritime embargo against Saudi Arabia, effective immediately. The statement threatened to respond to all escalation with all escalation, and called upon the Yemeni people to continue the general mobilization and general call to arms. Messages were subsequently broadcast over Marine VHF radio, warning vessels not to dock at Saudi ports or they would be treated as targets. An email was also sent to ship owners, warning that any vessel voyages conducted to or from Saudi ports would expose those vessels to targeting. Ship tracking data indicates that multiple tankers reversed course from the Bab al-Mandab Strait after July 20th. The Saudi Foreign Ministry condemned the declaration and rejected Houthi allegations of a siege of the Yemeni people. A spokesperson for the Saudi coalition stated that its forces would take steps to ensure the safety of commercial vessels transiting the Bab al-Mandab Strait. On July 21st, U.S. President Donald Trump said that the United States would take care of the Houthis if they implemented the blockade. On July 22nd, the Houthis released a statement claiming to have carried out an operation targeting two Saudi-flagged oil tankers, the Enselia and the Layla, using a number of ballistic and cruise missiles as well as drones. Saudi media reported that an attack caused a fire on the bow of the Enselia. The United Kingdom Maritime Trade Operations Centre also issued a warning that a tanker had been struck by a projectile 70 nautical miles southwest of Al-Shuqaiq, Saudi Arabia, with no reported casualties. The initial Houthi statement was issued 2 days after early warning systems were activated in Al-Kharj, southeast of Riyadh, where the Prince Sultan Air Base, which hosts U.S. forces, is located, and in Yanbu Governorate. The attack has been attributed to Iran, marking the first attempted Iranian strike against Saudi Arabia in over 3 months. It comes within the broader context of the Memorandum of Understanding between the United States and Iran having collapsed. Now our intelligence team's assessment. Houthi messaging likely indicates an intent to enforce the blockade in a manner similar to its anti-shipping campaign against Israel during the war in Gaza. During that campaign, the Houthis conducted attacks on vessels with links to Israel, and at times the United States, with many of these links being tenuous or even non-existent. The Houthi email sent to ship owners, along with VHF radio warnings, suggests that all vessels docking at Saudi ports, regardless of flag state, ownership, or crew nationality, could be subject to targeting if the Houthis follow through on their threats. While this has not yet materialized in attacks against vessels that are not Saudi-flagged, and given the Houthis' previously poor target acquisition practices, this almost certainly raises the risk profile for all vessels transiting the Red Sea. The Houthi attacks against the Ancelia and the Layla are likely to result in limited retaliatory strikes by Saudi Arabia against Houthi-controlled areas of Yemen. While these are likely to be calibrated to remain below the threshold for major escalation, any such strikes would likely trigger further Houthi attacks against targets in Saudi Arabia, increasing the risk of escalation. Moreover, U.S. involvement in strikes against the Houthis, as threatened by President Trump, would likely lead to an expansion of Houthi attacks on shipping, particularly to include U.S.-linked vessels. There is also a realistic possibility that the Houthis would launch attacks against U.S. military facilities in Saudi Arabia. During this recent period of heightened Saudi-Houthi tensions, the Houthis have launched an attack against Abha International Airport and have specifically threatened further strikes against Saudi airports and other vital interests on land and sea. Other potential options include direct Houthi attacks using missiles and drones against ports and critical infrastructure in Saudi Arabia, including Yanbu, Jeddah, and Jazan. The Houthis have previously conducted attacks against Israeli ports and Ben Gurion International Airport as part of a stated effort to enforce a blockade against Israel. The declared Houthi maritime blockade against Saudi Arabia is ostensibly aimed at pressuring Riyadh to lift its blockade of Houthi-controlled Yemen, in place since 2015. However, the declaration highly likely also serves to bolster Iran's leverage in the broader conflict, given the threat posed to the global economy by a potential closure of the Bab al-Mandab Strait alongside the Strait of Hormuz. The attack against targets in Saudi Arabia attributed to Iran is the first since April. This comparative lack of activity has almost certainly been due to the higher level of deterrence posed by Riyadh, reinforced by Pakistani deployments to Saudi Arabia under an agreed military alliance, as well as continued diplomatic efforts. Initial reporting suggests the attempted attack was limited, indicating it was likely primarily symbolic. Its timing, coinciding with the Houthi escalation, likely reflects an attempt by Tehran to deter further Saudi action against the Houthis. And in West Africa, a major joint offensive by Jenim and the Azawad Liberation Front has inflicted one of the Malian military's heaviest defeats in recent years. On July 18th, a combined attack by the Azawad Liberation Front and Jama'at Nusrat al-Islam wal-Muslimin killed at least 50 Malian armed forces soldiers as they departed the northern town of Anifis in a convoy heading towards Gao. The attackers captured a further 24 FAMA soldiers and destroyed or seized several vehicles. The ambush took place between the pastoral area of Tabrichat and the town of Tarkint. A FAMA aircraft arrived at the scene and attempted to target the attackers, but poor weather reportedly obscured its targeting. The attack followed weeks of fighting with both sides, FAMA and Russia's Africa Corps on one hand, and JNIM and the FLA on the other, attempting to secure control of the town. Now our intelligence team's assessment. The attack is the latest in a coordinated offensive by JNIM and FLA forces across the country since April 25, 2026. This has constituted the largest offensive in the Mali conflict since 2012, when the Tuareg-led National Movement for the Liberation of Azawad launched a rebellion against the Malian government, seeking independence for northern Mali, which it called Azawad. So far, the offensive has involved joint JNIM and FLA attacks in Azawadi-claimed territory in northern Mali, while JNIM has also operated independently in central and southern regions. More recently, on July 4th, Yemen and the FLA resumed the offensive, conducting coordinated attacks across multiple locations, including Anafis and Kenyaroba. These attacks damaged a key power transmission line, cutting electricity and running water in large areas. Anafis has become a key target for Yemen and the FLA. The town formed part of the government's late 2023 northern offensive, during which Malian and Russian-backed forces advanced along the Gao-Kidal axis and ultimately captured Kidal. While Yemen and the FLA temporarily seized the town on July 4th, FAMA and the Africa Corps re-established control between July 8th and 10th. If Yemen and the FLA succeed in capturing and holding Anifis, it would isolate and increase pressure on the military base in Aguelhok, the government's remaining outpost in the Kidal region, forcing it to rely on aerial resupply. The April 25th offensive relied on rapid coordinated attacks and hit-and-run tactics, with near-simultaneous strikes across multiple locations, fast-moving assaults using motorcycles and pickup trucks, the temporary seizure of strategic sites, and targeted attacks on high-value objectives. In contrast, the battle over Anafis has combined guerrilla warfare with more conventional tactics, resulting in a prolonged and attritional confrontation, with each side sustaining significant personnel and material losses. FAMA and the Africa Corps have lost major aerial assets, including a Su-24 tactical bomber and a helicopter. The latest attack almost certainly demonstrates the fragility of the government's hold over Anifis, with Yemen and FLA fighters retaining sufficient freedom of movement to operate in close proximity. Future movements between Gao and Anafis will likely require larger escorts, aerial surveillance, and route clearance operations, tying down forces that could otherwise be used to defend other locations. Moreover, the personnel losses on the government side make an imminent assault on Anafis more likely, as Yemen and the FLA attempt to capitalize on their victory. Turning to Asia-Pacific, rescue efforts continue after flash flooding in eastern Afghanistan left dozens dead and many more missing. Flash flooding, triggered by torrential rain, has killed at least 26 people, injured 89, and left more than 100 missing. Parun, the capital of Nuristan province, has experienced the worst impacts. Social media footage shows homes, shops, and municipal buildings destroyed by the flooding. A search and rescue operation is underway to locate those missing. The Afghan Ministry of Transport and Civil Aviation's Meteorological Department has forecast further heavy rain, thunderstorms, and flash floods across 10 of Afghanistan's 34 provinces in the coming days. Now our intelligence team's assessment. The death toll is highly likely to rise in the coming days, as some of those currently missing are confirmed dead. Parun is a remote mountainous location, which will almost certainly complicate search and rescue operations, particularly where roads, bridges, and communications infrastructure have been damaged or cut. The destruction of homes, shops, and municipal buildings has almost certainly further degraded local emergency response capacity, increasing reliance on already limited provincial and central government assistance. Further heavy rain is highly likely to worsen conditions across Nuristan and other affected provinces in the coming days. Heavily saturated ground increases the risk of additional flash flooding and landslides, while continued rainfall is likely to isolate rural communities and delay the delivery of medical assistance, food, shelter, and clean water. Transport disruption is likely to be particularly severe in narrow valleys and along mountain roads, where debris could block access. Beyond the immediate risk to life, the flooding is likely to cause prolonged humanitarian and economic disruption. Damage to housing, agricultural land, livestock, and local businesses is likely to displace affected households and destroy livelihoods, particularly in communities already facing high levels of poverty and limited access to public services. Water contamination, combined with overcrowding in temporary shelters, is also likely to increase the risk of disease outbreaks if relief operations are delayed or insufficient. And finally, in India, the student-led cockroach movement continues to gain momentum following large-scale clashes with police in Delhi. On July 20th, the Cockroach Janta Party staged a large protest in central Delhi. Around 20,000 demonstrators attempted to march from Jantar Mantar to Parliament House, coinciding with the opening day of the 2026 monsoon session of Parliament. Protesters clashed with police, resulting in at least 70 arrests and hundreds of injuries. Since June, protesters had maintained a camp in the Jantar Mantar area. The unrest on July 20th was partly triggered by the police removal, 2 days earlier, of an activist who had been conducting a prolonged hunger strike at the site. On July 21st, CJP leaders stated that they would refrain from staging further rallies in Delhi following the previous day's violence. However, additional anti-government unrest was recorded on July 22nd, with police again clashing with protesters. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. The CJP is a movement founded in mid-May 2026, following a scandal involving marking errors and leaks affecting school-leaving exams. The name derives from a remark by the Chief Justice of India, Surya Kant, who compared young unemployed students to cockroaches. The movement, which defines itself as secular, socialist, democratic and lazy, calls for greater government transparency and accountability, media independence, and gender equality. In June, the CJP staged its first major protest to coincide with the return of its founder, Abhijit Dipke, who had previously been based in the United States. Following its initial growth in popularity in May and June, with the movement's social media accounts gaining tens of millions of followers, the CJP has almost certainly evolved into a major political actor in the Delhi area. The CJP's primary support base is recent graduates under the age of 25, particularly those applying for positions in public administration and the healthcare sector. The movement has almost certainly tapped into growing discontent within India's white-collar job market, with approximately 40% of recent graduates unemployed. The Indian government has adopted a cautious approach towards the new movement. On July 20th, just before the protest, Prime Minister Narendra Modi held a brief meeting with several CJP leaders, reportedly focusing on some of the group's key demands. However, according to a CJP spokesperson, no commitments were made during the meeting. On July 21st, following the clashes, Modi called for the creation of an improved examination system to prevent a repeat of the controversy that triggered the protests. However, this is unlikely to placate the movement, whose leaders have increasingly called for more significant reforms. In particular, the movement's demand that Education Minister Dharmendra Pradhan resign has encountered significant opposition from the administration. The CJP is likely to continue growing, potentially expanding beyond Delhi, into areas where it already has large online followings that have not yet translated into street protests. However, the movement is also likely to remain largely confined to major urban centers with developed service sectors. With its core support drawn from highly educated middle-class individuals, the CJP highly likely currently lacks the breadth and appeal of larger labor unions and mass movements. While the July 21st announcement makes further large-scale protests in Delhi unlikely in the short term, future unrest linked to the CJP cannot be ruled out. The group's largely online presence is conducive to spontaneous organization by local activist networks, meaning CJP-linked protests remain possible even if they are opposed by the movement's main leaders. The protest on July 22nd almost certainly demonstrates this risk. That concludes this week's Global Intelligence Briefing. These updates are part of our Global Intelligence subscription, which includes weekly reports, in-depth briefings, and live Q&A sessions with our experts. To learn more, visit solisglobal.com. Thank you for listening.